What liberties are most dear to you? Your right to freedom of speech? The right to participate in government? The freedom to believe as your conscience dictates and not as the government demands? The right to choose your own destiny? These rights were not part of the lives of the families that will chronicle for you in this video. They lived in one of the most violent centuries in human history. The wars and persecutions they endured had consequences they could never have imagined for themselves, including the eventual creation of a new nation where freedom is considered our most cherished possession. I'm John Erickson, the Executive Director of St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum. This is part one of a two-part series about the 17th century, the century in which our old brick church was built. This is our stage to tell the dramatic stories about how we were born, how we moved from being subjects to citizens. In part one, we'll talk about the conflict between Cavaliers and Puritans. In part two, we'll talk about the architects of our freedom. It's essential that we remember this crucial time in our past and continue to learn its lessons. This is Born from Conflict, Cavaliers and Puritans of Newport Parish. Our story begins in England. The Cavaliers were those who backed King Charles I in his efforts to conform everyone in the United Kingdom around the state church, the Church of England. But there were many different groups within the kingdom who had different ideas about how the church should be structured and what its core tenets should be. Puritan was the name given to them by their detractors, but more simply put, they were Calvinists, followers of the Reformed tradition, or John Calvin. Some were Dissenters, those who wished to reform the church from within, and some were Separatists, those who believed the church was not redeemable. Among those Separatists was Edward Bennet. Edward Bennet was a London merchant, but he was born in Somerset, in Wiveliscombe, baptized here at St. Andrews. This is a 19th century church that was built on the same footprint as the medieval church that Edward Bennet would have been a part of. Bennet was responsible for hundreds of indentured servants being brought over to the colony of Virginia on the south side of the James River in Isle of Wight and in Nansemond. And it was on his property called Bennet's Welcome that 55 colonists were killed during the Opechancanough Offensive of 1622 that launched the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. Bennet was part of the ancient church, the Brownists, nonconformists who believed that the English Reformation did not go far enough. Religion was an important issue in the colonies, and in Virginia we had more Puritans than people realize today, but by mid-century they were all moved out by Sir William Berkeley, the governor of Virginia at that time. Brownists fled to Leiden in the Netherlands to avoid the persecution they had experienced back in the days of Queen Elizabeth I. They were English, and they were concerned that their continued presence in a foreign land would mean that their children would lose their sense of English identity. Another option for them was the Virginia colony. A year before their fellow pilgrims went to form Plymouth colony, they came to Virginia. Bennet would not emigrate to Virginia, but his brothers Richard and Robert would be his agents in the colony on the south side of the James River, originally called Warroscoiac-shire. Bennet's property would be the scene of the opening of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, the 1622 Opechancanough Offensive, where 53 colonists were killed on Bennet's Welcome on March the 22nd, 1622. But this was not the end of the influx of dissenters emigrating to Virginia. Bennet would be the sponsor of hundreds of indentured servants coming to Virginia through what became Isle of Wight and Nansemond counties. Bennet's nephew Richard Bennet would become his agent after the death of his brothers, and he would become the governor of Virginia during the Commonwealth period, and eventually converted to the Quaker faith. The many dissenters who came to Isle of Wight through the auspices of Edward Bennet was a young Puritan named William Durand, who would write in 1642 that the then minister of the lower parish, the Reverend Thomas Falconer, was a priest of Baal, who is hated by anyone with any good in them, even as he hateth all good men. Durand and many other Puritans from Isle of Wight, Nansemond, and Lower Norfolk would be expelled by Governor Berkeley just before mid-century. Durand would go on to Maryland, where a conflict between Puritans and Catholics would break out in 1655. Durand, like many other one-time Puritans, converted to Quakerism in the late 1650s. On the other side of the divide was a Cavalier family by the name of Fulgham. The Fulghams were also from Somerset, Pitminster, but they were connected by marriage to William Cotton, the Bishop of Exeter. Captain Anthony Fulgham and his first wife Elizabeth were married at the Church of St. Andrew's and St. Mary's in Pitminster. What was it like for a Cavalier family living amongst so many who leaned Puritan? Was this the cause of their emigrating to Virginia in 1640, just as the English Civil Wars were about to begin? We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that these divides often devolved into violence, and Virginia could be a place of refuge, whatever your religious identity was. Just a few short years after they left for Virginia, Somerset would be a place of siege in the First English Civil Wars. The casualties of this conflict would be proportionally as high or higher than those suffered by Great Britain in World War I. Captain Anthony would settle in Virginia just as hostilities were beginning at home in England. He owned land in both Lancaster and Isle of Wight counties. He was known to be a justice for Isle of Wight in the 1660s, and he died in 1669. His sons would play a large part in the history of Isle of Wight. Anthony Jr. would be embroiled in Bacon's Rebellion, an effort to undo the policies of Governor Sir William Berkeley. This conflict would move Virginia towards an almost exclusively enslaved labor force, and the many slave codes that would follow. It would also lead to the devastation of many indigenous tribes of the Powhatan chiefdom, including the Warascoigne. In 1683, another son of Captain Anthony, Michael Fulgham, would sell the land on which sat a church house or glebe. This land would become the site of our old brick church. Among other Cavaliers was the longest tenured minister of the 17th century for the Lower Parish, the Bracewell family of Holborn, London. The Reverend Robert Bracewell was educated at Hart Hall, Oxford, graduating in 1631, just 2 years into King Charles I's personal rule, where he governed without parliament. His hand-picked Archbishop, William Laud, would begin to institute policies that seemed to the Puritans too much like the old Roman Catholic polity. Laud would be arrested in 1640 and eventually executed for treason, but it would seem the Bracewells were firmly on the side of the king. We're here at St. Andrew's in the Holborn section of London. It was here at St. Andrew's that the Reverend Robert Bracewell was baptized in 1611, the same year as the first publication of the authorized version of the Bible, what we know as the King James Version. St. Andrews has a long and storied history, but one of the more fascinating stories came during the English Civil Wars, when parliamentarians stormed into St. Andrews and confronted the Reverend John Hackett. Hackett continued to use the Book of Common Prayer in violation of the Puritan rules. They put a gun to his head, and he said, "I'm doing my duty, now you do yours." They did not fire. It was a small symbolic victory for the Royalists, but it was going to take more than symbolism to win. Unfortunately for them, they lost out, and the Reverend Robert Bracewell emigrated to Virginia, where he became the last clergyman to serve on the House of Burgesses in Virginia. We believe that it was on the glebe property that now contains the old brick church that the Reverend Bracewell once lived. Reverend Bracewell would serve the Lower Parish, later called Newport Parish, from 1653 until his death in 1668. In that same year that he began his service to the Lower Parish, he was elected to the House of Burgesses, but was promptly removed when the Burgesses passed a law prohibiting clergy from serving. It was a move to check the power of the clergy in the governance of the colony. Bracewell owned more than 300 acres of land and may have lived on the very site that the old brick church was built on after his death. A generation later, Joseph Bridger would be the Cavalier with the most direct impact on the old brick church. Bridger was the son of Samuel Bridger, an auditor for Gloucester Cathedral and the adjoining King's School. He was born at Woodmancote in Dursley. The English Civil Wars would erupt when Bridger was a child, and his home church, the Church of St. James the Great, as their history records suggest, would see the parliamentarians remove the altar, cover up the baptismal font, and the bells of the church were silenced. Bridger was raised in a highly Cavalier environment. His grandfather, the Reverend Lawrence Bridger, was rector of St. John the Evangelist Church in Slintridge, a short distance from Dursley. He served for 53 years, beginning in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. But Joseph would go on in a different direction than both his father and grandfather, choosing a military career that would also move him into the realms of politics and government. We know little of Joseph Bridger's service, but family tradition suggests that he was present at the Battle of Worcester, the last battle of the English Civil Wars. September the 3rd, 1651. More than 2 years after his father Charles I was executed, the man who had been crowned by the Scotch, Charles II, watched his fate from the spire of Worcester Cathedral. His 16,000 largely Scottish forces faced off against 28,000 of the new model army of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell split his forces into two on the borders of the Severn and the Thames rivers and crushed the royalist forces. Charles II managed to escape to live for another day, but most of the forces that were captured were sent to Bermuda, Barbados, and Virginia, perhaps among them a young officer by the name of Joseph Bridger. For the next 9 years, England would be ruled by a protectorate with a constitution. This document would give far greater liberties to the many disparate religious groups, including the return of the Jewish community for the first time since 1290. But fighting among the various Puritan groups would undermine the protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. After his death, his son Richard did not hold power, but Charles II was invited and restored to the throne in 1660. With the restoration came a storm of retribution against those who had killed their king, Charles I, in January of 1649. In the 17th century, no bishops ever stepped foot on colonial soil. So it was the Bishop of London, the Bishop of St. Paul's Cathedral, who oversaw the colonial church. But he was very much an absentee ruler. So it was the vestries that had control in Virginia. It was required of all of the king's subjects to attend worship once a month, and their highest tax was the tithe that you paid to your parish, based on the number of adult members of your household, including enslaved people. In the 17th century, the church in Virginia was very much about controlling behavior, extending empire, and keeping down rebellion. The worst of their fears was realized in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. Bridger would make a name for himself by fighting against the rebels in Bacon's Rebellion, a conflict that continues to have ramifications even to this day. In 1677, after the death of Nathaniel Bacon, Bridger was interviewed by commissioners from England. He informed them of the potential for further rebellion. While Governor Berkeley, sent back to England in disgrace and soon died, Bridger was elevated by his service. He would become the head of 9 counties' militias and would become a 2-time interim governor of the colony. He married Hester Pitt. Ironically, her father, Colonel Robert Pitt, a wealthy merchant, was, according to some sources, a Puritan. Joseph Bridger died of lead poisoning, or dry gripes as it was known in the 17th century. His ledger stone suggests that he would be forgotten, but that certainly is not the case for us, with this place affectionately known as the Old Brick Church, which would not have been possible without Bridger's patronage. Just as the last bricks for the Old Brick Church were being laid, King Charles II would die, and his Catholic brother James would become James II. Many in England worried about a return to Catholicism like they had experienced during the reign of Queen Mary I, known to many as Bloody Mary. Even before Charles II died in February of 1685, the succession crisis aroused fears of another English civil war. While what followed was something far short of that, another rebellion would arise in England known as the Monmouth Rebellion. The Duke of Monmouth was the illegitimate son of Charles II and a devout Protestant. The rebellion would fail and the Duke brutally executed. But a few short years later, King James II would be deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. William of Orange of the Netherlands and his English wife Mary would be co-regents and an act of toleration would soon follow. What the English had figured out was that religious uniformity was no longer possible, and that the key to empire was allowing these disparate Protestant groups to buy into the goals of empire. As long as you were aligned with empire, you would not be molested for your religious beliefs. The Quakers, with their dedication to pacifism, did not align with those values, and a wave of persecution followed in both England and Virginia. No one in our story could have imagined that the events of their lifetime would eventually lead to a dramatic shift in the way people understood the role of government, and how ordinary people could move from being obedient subjects of tyrannical rule to citizens whose civic responsibilities include holding those in power accountable when they infringe on the rights that we consider to be sacred and undeniable. Most near and dear being the right to believe as your conscience dictates. Religious freedom was not anyone's goal in the 17th century, but it became the essential unintended consequence. That's what history is all about. A movement that continues to bend towards freedom and justice for all people, despite those tyrants who sometimes fight against that tide. There are always challenges along the way towards that more perfect union. But today, the descendants of these 17th century families make up the fabric of our American Republic. But long before the United States came into being, many battles would have to be waged, both military and philosophical. How did we move from being a united Protestant empire into a nation with individual freedoms and responsibilities in self-government? We'll answer those questions in part 2, Born from Conflict, the Architects of Our Freedom. But until then, just one more thought to ponder.